to understand it. And I found that, well, I had quite a problem of lack of communication with my family, with my father especially. And he was trying to be as helpful as he could. He made a point, he probably suspected that I had something to do with drug activities, but when people asked me about it, he would make a point of saying, no, you don't have to answer that. Why should he answer questions like that? He bent over backwards to make life comfortable for me and easy for me and so on and so forth, and the more he did it, the less I felt that I could communicate with him. We never had any arguments, we never had any disagreements. You know, when I finally was able to communicate with him was after I saw that in order to do this, I had to make some changes myself in my own point of view. And I have found, mysticism aside from this, I have found that giving up the drugs, realizing that the sense of reality beyond the games of life and all of that I had been looking for, the sense of beauty in this world, which had been very much obscured since then, comes from sacrificing, from giving of yourself, from saying, well, my point of view may be wrong. What is it like from the point of view of the establishment, instead of saying, this is all the establishment, we can't deal with them because they're phonies and they're hypocrites. Well, there is phoniness, there is hypocrisy, but it's not the fault of the patterns which the older generation have. It's the fault of hypocrisy in itself, and there is hypocrisy in the hippie movement just as there is hypocrisy in the establishment. And I think that it's being able to see it from the other person's point of view that is the only way that the communication can be established. And I think that we are all trying to do this. I think that this conference indicates that we've been trying to see it from the students' point of view, and now I think the students who have taken the drug should try and learn to see it from the rest of the world's point of view.
One moment. Al wants to say something, and then I'm going to throw questions open to the floor. I'm going to ask members of the panel, though, to limit themselves to rather brief answers at this time, so that we can have as much discussion now as possible in our remaining time. Al?
Kind of shows you it's not only professors that are long-winded. Just this comment on what can be done by administration or faculty. Anybody that's a businessman, for that matter, realize the fact that if you want to convince somebody of something, pedantic preaching is a long way from getting something accomplished. And the idea is, when a student comes into you and says, I've been up on LSD, and like, I've seen beauty, or I've seen love, or I've seen a lot of other things. Now, whether he saw them or not, and that's indeed questionable oftentimes, it's a statement that he says he has. And you are not going to convince him by saying that's wrong, because what are you initially condemning, therefore? What is your job to do, or the job of the person who's trying to work with people, and I found it often my position, is say, yes, you saw beauty, but perhaps there may lie in a greater beauty if one is to change and look at it from a different point. That although one may find a beauty when his mind is under something else, think how much more, how triple this beauty might be if one is to come on it through himself without the use of drugs. And this is the right way. One does not come above, particularly students who are extremely idealistic. Young people have this way. The one thing they have more than anything else is perhaps is faith or hope. And if you're going to completely come across as a negative reaction, then they're not going to listen to you. They're going to shut their ears as soon as the first word is, you should not. You say not, they're gone. They may be there, but their head's up in the clouds. Don't say no. Say yes in a more positive way. The beauty is spelled many different ways and doesn't have to necessarily have to be spelled in 3 letters LSD, but can be spelled MAN too.
I would really like to say something.
I don't think confidentiality is the thing that, at least I found is the major hang-up on the part of uniques, if you want to call them that, in utilizing counseling services. I think it is the assumption that the value system of the counselor or the psychologist represents that of the establishment, and that the deviation from the accustomed orderly steps toward achievement that we hope actually and expect of students is a thing that they will come back to. Now, everybody from Jack Kennedy on down has taken a year out of college to think things over and get his values straightened out and so on, and come back with a self-motivating, self-derived desire to get where he wants to go, become the kind of person that he wants to be. This is not untypical at all, but this movement is quite different, I think, from that. The straight, what is it, the district in San Francisco?
Haight-Ashbury.
Kind of community represents I think, the nebulous of a new social movement. Now, as such, what does it represent? I asked Al this question last night, and a social movement must have an articulate social philosophy. The word love has to be spelled out in terms of action. People cannot live as isolated individuals. They live in a matrix of relationships, which eventually evolve into a new kind of establishment. Now, what kind of establishment is that going to be? What kinds of articulation of social philosophies is evolving among this group? What eventually constructive, hopefully, goals are at least implicit, if not completely articulated in this student group? This is a question that interests me.
Do you want to?
Was I don't think it's clearly articulated. I think there's been a lot of talk about the hypocrisy of the love in the Haight-Ashbury, but I think it's important to because I think a lot of it is exaggerated. I see a lot of the people exaggerating giving and loving in the Haight-Ashbury, but there's a desire. They might go overboard, but they do want to feel loving. They do want to feel to be in a non-alienated, friendly environment. I'd like to respond to the statement over here, which somewhat reflects on this. The person comes to the counselor usually with the idea that he's got a problem that he wants to discuss on a problem-solving basis. And I feel that you would not get the understanding of what you're trying to say because it's immediately considered a problem that you have to solve, when maybe what is really wanted is a means of communication. I saw an incident in the Haight-Ashbury which was kind of interesting. 3 hippies were hitchhiking, a girl and 2 guys, one morning, and I saw a Buick come down the street with a woman about 55 or 60, lovely white silver hair, nicely coiffed, and pretty much the image of what I would expect the person who would just kind of snub their noses at the hippies. Well, she pulled over and offered them a ride. And the girl just squealed with delight. And they were just so pleased, so happy, that the people, and this is pretty largely supported, the people in the community, the older people, who make up the other large portion, somehow accept them. I think the question has been asked, do you have to take drugs to understand what's going on? Well, you might not be able to understand the drug experience, but I think almost everyone here can think and feel of times when they wanted to be totally irresponsible. They wanted to be out of the pressures of society and pressures of achieving, the pressures that where the students are placed on of going through 12 years of school, putting on a suit and tie, going to college, being responsible all the way through college, and immediately jump into a position of engineering and such without any time out. Now, I've had, as a result of my research, a number of professionals, a number of high school teachers and professors who came wanting to take LSD. So where can I get some LSD? I'd like to take it so I could understand what's happening to my students. A high school teacher came and said, I'd like to take LSD so that I can talk to them. But what I really felt was what he was saying is, I want to be part of it also. And I don't think he has to take drugs, although he did, I understand, and his communications improved in the literature class that he's in. But he also has this identifying period of wanting to question the values. And I don't think there's any harm in that. I think there can be great help to these kids, too, in allowing them to question the values and responding to them in yourself, because I think almost everyone has got some feeling, and that may help communication.
In the articulation of the Ashbury community you're speaking about, have you found any of the religious leaders, particularly the traditional Western religious leaders, interested or involved? And secondly, do you think the community wants them to be?
I think the community would want them to be, yes. I think if there's any sincere attempt to communicate, to listen, maybe to experience, be it the be-ins, they really appreciate. In fact, I remember seeing several nuns at the Human Being, and many of the kids were very pleased to see them there. Because essentially, first of all, you're human, and then secondly, you are whatever you are in a observable role. I don't know of any, personally, of Christian leaders in the community. I know Dr. Pike is highly respected by the kids. Also, another thing I'd like to point out is there's a tremendous stress of Leary as being the leader. And in the Haight-Ashbury, he is out. He is not the leader, as far as the Haight-Ashbury people feel. At the Human Being, he came on much too strong. He came on like saying, I want to tell you where it's at. Tune in, turn on, and drop out. And the tone of his voice was very much in contrast with the feeling in the air. He came off very badly. It might be important, maybe for some of the kids who are on the borderline, though, and there is importance.
I understand that the term tune in, turn on, and drop out wasn't really started by Leary, but it was used by Paulson at Berkeley and Friedman at San Francisco State in describing Leary, but he liked it, so he adopted it.
I just want to say one thing, that these people that come across these theories, there's no doubt that if you become dogmatic to the left and there is a dogmatic right, that it is a spectrum, a circular spectrum, and pretty soon you come around and you're standing next to each other. A reporter said he was sitting in a room and he shut his eyes, and the hippies were standing around and said, we've got to limit government, there's too much government control, and we have to do it through action, we have to be active in this way. And he shut his eyes and he couldn't tell if he was in a DAR meeting or a meeting from somebody from the hippie section.
There was a lady.
I just want to say, don't you think that adults question the value system too?
Yes.
Don't you think that we too are continually looking at increasing law?
Yeah.
I mean, it's almost as though we're two different species. It's a feeling I get. Maybe it's just that we don't think that drugs are related to the nicotine method that we object to. Not the fact that you're simply because we are too.
Well, I don't think condemn the drugs. I mean, don't to condemn the whole movement just for the drugs. Also, I agree that there is a desire to question the values and to feel love, but I think a lot of hippies feel that. But you're still going to not show much movement in making changes in the establishment, making changes that may help. They feel it's much easier to start a new community, which they're planning to do. It's
Trying to identify the What is this that you talk about?
Yeah.
We have time just for one or two more questions.
I wonder if, rather than moving toward becoming another social movement, hippie culture, we use the term broadly, isn't more in the nature of a sort of native, unconscious existential reaction to a sense of being boxed in by the square run? If it isn't a little closer, perhaps, to anarchy, in the best sense of the term, not the popular sense, than it is to something becoming another social movement in turn become rigid and ossified.
Brief.
I think you're right to a great extent. There's most people that are in this hippie movement, as you call it, we decided to put a label on it now just for the sake of discussion, are people from middle class or upper middle class homes, for that matter, that have had a great deal of things given to them in life and have become upset because these things have been given to them, and are upset with the value systems that this establishment, the middle class, the upper middle class, the nouveau riche, what you will, have established. And this is the establishment they're striking out against. Now, these people are able to talk in ideals, and this is where they move. There's very few among these people that transfer this ideal into a form of action. That is, many times it is, and indeed, a screaming into the wind. Now, there are different groups forming all around. Is it a social action? Well, it's social if it concerns people and if they're doing something. Is it just anarchy? At times, aren't we most of us acting in anarchy if we didn't have a leader anyway? So I'm sure. I think a great deal of it is idealization, though.
I will have to stop. We're going to have to stop, but I would like to thank members of the panel, and I would like to say just one last word. All right. The important thing I would like to say, very briefly, is that a rigid position is not going to help any of us. I think too often we take opposite kinds of poles, and I think students do this too, and also that what you speak of as anarchy may be a kind, for some students, of generational rebellion. So there are many different things that enter into this drug culture, but not to be suggestible. That's the important thing. Some students are sort of in limbo, and they are suggestible to their friends who may be members of drug culture, and they'll be more suggestible to members of the older generation who are more willing to listen and to try to understand. One brief word now from Mr. Rinker.
Yes, something that might help when you go back to campuses. You might wonder, the book was mentioned last night, does it represent the views of the hippies or the people in the Haight-Ashbury? And I had the same question in mind. I agreed with quite a bit what he said here, Mr. Simmons, and it's happening. So I asked a lot of my friends and a lot of hippies in the Haight-Ashbury, and I didn't meet a single one who disagreed. They had criticisms, some saying it was a little clumsily written, but they felt it was a sincere effort and a fairly successful effort in expressing what they feel. So that I do think it is a valuable possible means of understanding what is happening.
Thanks.
We'll take a break for about 5 minutes. Bring your coffee back, have a chair, and we'll proceed with the next session in about 5 minutes.
I'm going to need to do a little reading.
Yeah, we got this podium right here.
There are quite a large segment of kids who have gone through the psychedelic world and are now turned on by the group called the Transcendental Mystics at UCLA. Or something of the sort. They all have their gurus. They all have their gurus. See, it's thinking
Just before we begin this next session, I'm going to ask Dr. Nollis to make an announcement here concerning an important aspect of the evaluation. Dr. Nollis?
I hate to keep popping up, but from experience, and I've had a lot of it in the last 4 weeks, I recognize that a number of people, for good and valid reasons, do get away before the final formal resume and evaluation. You will find on your chairs, or will have picked up over on the table, a rather formidable form. We're a little bit embarrassed to impose it on you, but we do feel that it's extremely important for a variety of reasons. This is the one thing that will be a thread through all 7 of the regional conferences, and it is extremely important to us. A number of people are making surveys of student attitudes. As far as we know, no one has yet tried to look at the attitudes of college administrators. Now, this won't be a research study, but we hope, and won't come out with definitive answers, but we hope it will provide some hypotheses on which we can proceed to better design instruments and better design studies. Everything we do on this program seems to be CRASH with a capital C, and, total pretest 12 people, but at least we went through the motions. This is important to us also because a number of people are watching this program and looking to its success or failure as a guide to the utilization of this kind of approach to a variety of problems. So that it is important that we be able to say to some of these people when they say, well, how did it come out? Did it work? Do you recommend it? That we have some data available. This will take you, I'm afraid, about half an hour if you, once you get into it. We invite you to take it along with you, do it over lunch, or stay at the end of the program and finish it. But it is very important to us that we have it. This will be the thing that will help us tie together all 7 of these conferences. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Nollis. We're crowding a lot into a short time this morning, all of which we think is very important, and I'm sure on your way home you'll have a chance to think through many of these things at a more leisurely pace. The theme for this session is regarding the psychological, sociological, and religious aspects of a drug problem. We have 2 speakers, Dr. Henry Bruin, who is the Director of the Student Health Services at the University of California, and he will be followed by Father Carlo A. Weber, Director of Psychological Services from Loyola University. First, Dr. Bruin.
After the remarkable smorgasbord that we've been subjected to in the last 2 days, I feel as if at this point I should merely say I agree with everything that's been said and sit down. I'd like to address myself, though, to the topic of communicating with the student, and a great deal of what I am going to be saying you have heard echoes of from other speakers.
I've entitled my diatribe, "You've Got to Know the Territory." The marketing of an ethical and well-designed product by a conscientious, honest, enthusiastic, well-trained, intelligent salesman would seem entirely similar to the teaching of a facet of knowledge by a conscientious, honest, enthusiastic, well-trained, intelligent educator. In each instance, however, the sine qua non before stepping before the pupil or the customer is expressed eloquently by Professor Harold Hill and the Music Man by the song "You've Got to Know the Territory." Putting some of these thoughts further into focus, it has been said that the recipient of communication is the thing that determines whether communication has happened at all. The recipient validates communication through his behavior, and only through his behavior can we tell whether a communication has been more than interpersonal noise. It's probably true that much of the intended communication of our world misfires, miscarries, or fails entirely because of the communicator pays more attention to his bow and arrow than he does to his target. In the field of drug education for the young adult, the educational community, the public community, and the family have usually demonstrated remarkable ignorance of the territory and have thereby failed to provide a meaningful, honest foundation for the young adult and his attitudes towards substance abuse. I think we've certainly heard examples of that in this conference. The substance abuse certainly seems to have grown to epidemic proportions, and I think it's wise to emphasize that this is not an epidemic of the young adults in the college age. It's an epidemic that started as an epidemic after World War II in the adult community. It's necessary to review briefly some of the characteristics of this young adult target, which are of, I think, major significance when we consider this interaction between college youth, the college administrator, and drug abuse. With apologies to the more erudite and experienced psychologists and psychiatrists present, I use Erik Erikson as my guide in this area. Erikson has described the developmental process culminating in the young adult of college age as passing through a series of stages from infancy onward. Each of these stages is characterized by problems, struggles, and progress towards solutions. Erikson describes the school age as the phase of learning how to do things and accomplish projects, and a stage in which a sense of inadequacy and inferiority is frequently faced and dealt with. The adolescent years introduce the concept of identity versus identity diffusion. This is a time of physiological revolution with rapid growth and sexual maturity. It's during these years that the emphasis is on the questioning of all the sameness and all the continuities which have previously been accepted and relied upon. The young person growing is continually refighting some of the old struggles as he finds what apparently are new solutions. I think it's important to realize that the young adult of college age is refighting some of those battles in the school age and the adolescent years. The diffusion of self-identification results in a negative identity which fights all that parents, adults, and the community seems to be expecting. This diffusion of identity has nothing to do, in this sense, of defiance or revolt. It's entirely a problem of the growth and development of the personality. Erikson's next stage brings us to the college years with the young adult whose his biggest struggle is with the problem of intimacy versus isolation. Security in his own identity allows for sharing his identity with others. The young adult may hesitate, therefore, to take on intimate relationships with others because of fear of losing something of his own identity. He thus develops a deep sense of isolation. His problems of identity development in the adolescent years, his problems of struggle in the school years of struggle with inferiority feelings, these all then come into focus in this young adult years as he relives some of those events. Most scholars of young people and most experienced individuals who have worked with young people are very much aware that the adolescent and the young adult is especially sensitive to hypocrisy, bigotry, and the lie. It follows that such attitudes, and attitudes based on such factors, will be especially severe irritants during the young adult years. The idealistic young adult critically evaluates society as he sees it, and earnestly and at times violently struggles for a better world. It's characteristic that the young adult will try to work out emotional conflicts in dramatic and sometimes antisocial demonstration. Dr. Dana Farnsworth has emphasized that the application of punitive sanctions at this period in the development of the personality may perpetuate undesirable behavior and may make rebellion even more intense. Such punishments seem to justify the young adult's resentment and postpones or prevents the acquisition of self-control. With this brief review of the characteristics and quality of our target on the college campus in mind, examples might further illustrate some of the communication problems. I'll start with these examples are drawn from life, as we say, and I'll start with a rather wild one that you might see how it comes onto the college campus. But this is a salesman who's employed by a large and vigorous drug company to promote a new product among the medical profession. The salesman enters a doctor's office close to noontime because he figures maybe that's a good time. He smiles at the receptionist and strides across the room to knock briefly on the doctor's door, open it, and walk in. His entrance interrupts a phone conversation between the doctor and a patient, which interruption the salesman ignores and launches immediately into his pitch about his product, a hormone preparation for use in elderly women. He's unaware that the physician to whom he's speaking is a gynecologist and very familiar with the product. The salesman's attitude towards his potential customer is imperious, and the physician is unable to interrupt him for several minutes. When he asks the physician if he would be willing to place an order for this drug, the not unexpected answer is a resounding no, accompanied by a very vigorous and explicit instructions to leave the office. This salesman failed because of an abysmal ignorance of his target. Contrasting this, a college decides to put on a series of lectures to the student body on topics of concern to the administration. Among these topics is the use of drugs by the students. The student body is rallied by an announcement that the possibility of allowing alcoholic beverages on campus will be discussed. This seductive approach results in a massive turnout. The lecture was then given by a member of the faculty in philosophy whose personal religion forbids the use of alcohol or drugs in any form. The information presented is poorly disguised temperance material, and the use of drugs and alcohol by the young adult is presented as a moral issue and as the first step towards complete degradation of the soul. Here the teacher or administration demonstrates an equally remarkable ignorance of the target. A further example would be the college which puts on a series of 3 motion pictures on the subject of drug addiction. These productions emphasize the horrors of the heroin addict's world, the exaggerated criminal activities, and the implied common result of insanity. No one from the college administration is available to answer questions. The motion pictures are shown, the lights are turned on, and the result is hilarity and resentment. I think that another example of that was brought out this morning. I won't belabor it any further, but the use of the cartoon book that Mr. Rinker used appallingly, this is being used on college campuses and being distributed to college students. I think this is another example of a deep lack of understanding of the target. Now, the broad topical communication areas for dialogue between the student body, the personnel administrators, the physician, and the institutional administration, I think can be summarized in a few areas. The first area for communication is federal and state laws. I have found in traveling around and discussing this subject in high schools and colleges for some years, a remarkable, abysmal ignorance on the part of most responsible administrators on the subject of exactly what the laws are in regard these substances which are being abused. I think the university and college administration should have a very clear concept of what the laws are and how they apply and where they apply. And we've certainly had some of that material presented to us in these sessions, and I think that's very valuable. Now, local, county, or municipal ordinances are also very important. And they may vary, they may extend, and they may modify the state and federal laws. And I think it's very important that the college administrations be familiar with their local law enforcement people and be in good communication with them, open and that is open lines and sharing concerns and problems. I think this is a very important thing. I'm very grateful in Berkeley for what I think is an open line to our law enforcement people in that city. Now, thirdly, an area of communication is the policy of the college or university. This policy should be loudly and clearly stated with as little ambiguity as possible. This, again, is a very rare event in my experience. Now, I might give you an example just to illustrate what I mean. This is from a college, or it's from a university in a neighboring state. It is a statement in regard to alcohol, but I think the principles involved in this statement can be applied to drugs as well. This is a statement in the general catalog, which is distributed to all students and parents and curiosity seekers. Like most general catalogs, it may be read by 10% of the student body. The statement is also posted prominently in various parts of the campus. And it states, the policy relative to alcoholic beverages, and for this read drugs, if you will, involves a minimum of rules and a maximum of individual and group responsibility. This university must at all times uphold the state and city statutes relative to alcoholic beverages. It interprets this to include that the storage, possession, and use of alcoholic beverages is not allowed in university-supervised houses, apartments, residence halls, on sorority and fraternity property, on the university campus, or on other university property. That's fine. That's that university's interpretation of their local and state laws and statutes. I'm not recommending that that is your policy, but I'm saying this is a recognition by them right away of how they interpret their laws in their community. Further, any student of legal age who exhibits offensive behavior on university-owned or supervised property while under the influence of alcoholic beverages will be subject to disciplinary action. Now, it will be noted that this sort of statement reflects not only the knowledge about regulations of the city and state laws, but it emphasizes that, quote, offensive behavior, unquote, under the influence of alcohol, or for that matter, drugs, will be subject to university sanction. This type of university policy has the advantage of being straightforward, of reflecting realism, and with a clear-cut definition of the way in which alcohol or drugs is of concern to the university administration. Now, a fourth area of communication with the student body is certainly the area of health education. Now, some of you may be involved with institutions in which health education courses are required. This is not common, but there are available in most institutions courses involving the broad area of health. I think it's very important that these courses be evaluated and reviewed in terms of what they are saying about drugs and other types of substance abuse. There are also very wonderful opportunities for informal presentations involving the subject of health education. Many subjects can be discussed in these things, including such topics as substance abuse, venereal disease, cigarette smoking, alcohol, sex, motorcycle accidents, etc. These kinds of topics, I think, should be part of the plan of a university or college administration on a routine basis. I think these informal sessions on such topics require, indeed demand, deeply involved student participation, student panels, student speakers on these topics of what could be called informal health education. Now, the fifth area is the one that I hear the most about. This is the student with a problem involving drug abuse. When he presents himself to somebody in the college or university or high school administration. I've gotten around a great deal with high schools. I come from a background of practice in pediatrics in which I worked for 15 years with PTA boards and school boards in the various areas of health education. And the most common question that I've been asked in this time is, what do I say, etc., etc. And we've certainly heard that here in these sessions. We heard it at our workshop yesterday. What do I say when? This is the moment when the administrator or the physician must exploit the opportunity with very special skill and, above all, with firmness, conviction, and sincerity. Sincerity, honesty. All of which, hopefully, will be based on facts and knowledge about drugs. And that's one of the purposes, one of the many purposes of this kind of a conference, is to provide some more ideas and some more knowledge about drugs. This moment, the moment when the student presents himself, is, I believe, a very crucial one. It's very difficult to draw up a handbook on how to answer questions. I've done it somewhat facetiously at times. Like, what do you do when the student says to you, I'm smoking marijuana? A, change the subject. B, tell him about the law. C, get mad. D, remind him of university regulations, etc. This is not easy to give you a recipe in advance. I want to emphasize, however, that I think the basic area is a combination of knowing something about the young adult who is saying that to you, knowing something about him in general, and eventually learning something about him specifically. I have the other one, is what do you do when somebody is walking around naked and raving about the glories of LSD? A, turn your back. B, give him your coat. C, call the police. And one inhabitant of a suburb of the Bay Area took an axe to him, which I think is probably a relatively violent reaction, and I wouldn't condone it. He certainly expressed some thoughts by that act, but it was a very negative thought. The young adult in this situation, I think most of all, needs a firm, decisive opinion. You've all got some opinions, I hope. They may be subject to a great deal of debate and a great deal of philosophical discussion, but I would enjoin you to express your opinions without equivocating and without saying, and without blaming somebody else, like, I've heard that. What are your opinions? And I think you must form some of these opinions ahead of time, knowing that you will be, if you haven't already, been faced with this individual student with his problem. Now, while moral laws have as much significance in our culture as civil laws, certainly, it's clear that moralizing will result in a very distracting argument in which the young adult leads himself and the educator into all sorts of completely irrelevant byways. Frank, open recognition of the inequities and ambiguities in our social order and the legal climate prevents another distracting type of debate. Now, I must interject a thought on this confidentiality factor in this moment with the student, and I think I am hung on this, and I think it's a frustrating thing. I think it's rather difficult for the administrator who is identified with punishment, discipline, rules, rewards, scholarships, grades, and finances. I think it's very difficult for that person to say, I am completely, I am completely in your confidence, and I will not, you can trust me. I don't think the student believes this, and I don't blame him. I think it's very difficult for him to take this person in that kind of a role into his confidence. And I think that the university and college must do well to review the areas where the confidence or where the communication and the interchange is privileged, and also must identify the role in which the administrator wishes to place himself. I think this is a hang-up, and I think it's an important one. I'm frustrated by it, and I think some of you are too. But I think it must be faced, and lines must be drawn, and we must identify the privileged areas where this confidence is safe. Now, I must touch on one last area of the communication problem, which I believe to be significant and, again, frustrating in approaching it. And by this I mean the massive impact of news media. And you've heard something of that in this conference also. The public and campus press, radio, TV, and the magazines all have had a great deal to say in the last 5 years. I think to say that some of this material has been titillating, seductive, and stimulating is an understatement. The fascinating and exciting, dramatic picture of the drug scene that has been presented, I think, has certainly distorted the problem. I must give 3 examples of some of the effect of this. One is the nutmeg caper. Nutmeg was publicized in the Ladies' Home Journal one year with a banner headline on the outside cover, hallucinogens, or hallucinogenic drugs. And in the body of the article was a description of the fact that nutmeg would produce hallucinations. Having some contact with the local cigar store where magazines were sold, I am able to determine that within 26 hours of the magazine hitting the deck, we had 3 girls hospitalized for acute gastritis due to nutmeg ingestion. This is a fairly fast take-up. The latest thing we've been through, or we haven't been through it. The latest thing we're going through is the banana peel caper. We have some time factors on this. You've heard a little bit about it yesterday morning. That adds to our calendar. It was published in the Berkeley Barb, which is a communication mechanism in the hippie world, if you will, on Friday a week ago. And in the Berkeley Barb was a recipe for how to prepare it and what to expect. On Saturday, now the Berkeley Barb does not have, I think, a massive circulation, but it has a significant audience. However, on Saturday morning, the San Francisco Chronicle had on the front page a headline article about how to prepare banana peel to produce hallucinations. On Monday, I had 5 phone calls, 3 of whom were from students and 2 of whom were from faculty members who wanted to know what I knew about this. And my answer was, beats the hell out of me. I don't know anything about it. The Tuesday passed relatively quietly. I had a call from a neighboring community police officer and a call from a lawyer inquiring about, what's with the banana peel. On Wednesday, I had a call from our dean's office announcing that 4 students were sitting on the steps of, I guess it must have been Sproul Hall, and they were smoking something that looked like cigarettes, but they had a sign over them that said they were smoking banana peel. Question, is there anything that we should be concerned about? And I don't, again, my answer is I don't know. What should our stance be at this point? Well, there's no law against smoking banana peel, and that's about it. On Wednesday night, when I got home, my 17-year-old boy, who is a junior in high school, presented me with a piece of tinfoil, and inside it was some brown powder. And I said, "What's that?" And he says, "That's banana peel." And I said, "Where did you get it?" And he said, "I made it." And I said, "Where?" He said, "In the kitchen." And I said, "Well, what are you going to do with it?" And he said, "I'm not going to do anything with it." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Because I guess I'm like you, I'm chicken." And there have been some rare occasions when I've been able to express my pride and gratitude to my boys, and that was one of them. It's interesting looking stuff. It looks like coffee, and I have no idea what it does. I hope to find out. At the rate we're going, it'll be fairly soon. But this explosion of communication in the public media, I think, has contributed markedly to the problems we see now. I think it contributes to the fringe area, it contributes to the curiosity seeker, the daring explorer, etc. And the third example I would give is one that I noted in an interview with Timothy Leary in an excellent magazine, otherwise excellent magazine, Playboy magazine, in which he stated to the approximately 4 million readers that LSD was the most powerful aphrodisiac ever known to man. Now, I would submit that that's sort of stimulating to the general public and the reader. I'm sure that has been widely quoted. Now, what we do about the public media, I don't know. I really don't know. I think we have a hang-up between freedom of the press and responsible reporting and inciting things like the use of some of these substances. I think, however, that a college or university campus has some responsibility for guidance, and this again is very frustrating, but guidance of campus publications. The summary of what I'm trying to say then is that the college or university administration must face this challenge of serious and widespread substance abuse by the young adult, utilizing fully our hopefully well-established knowledge of the personality of the young adult that we're dealing with, as well as our rapidly developing knowledge of the complex drug world. Thank you.
We thank you, Dr. Bruin, for a very informative talk. We just had a message from the management that the special on the luncheon this noon will be Mexican banana splits. Make your own, yes. Our next speaker on the religious aspects of the drug situation is Father Carlo Weber.
Thank you very much, Dr. Benz. At almost the close now of what has been a day and a half of what Dr. Bruin has described as a smorgasbord of fact and opinion about this complex issue, and in the face of the many dilemmas and frustrations which you must face as administrators who contend with this problem on the campus, I'm not altogether sure right now whether the placement of the religious aspects of the drug at the very close of this program constitutes some indication of culmination or last resort. I am asked to restrict myself to the religious aspects. I'm very tempted, and I must share this temptation with you. I'm very tempted to comment on many of the points that Dr. Bruin has made and those that have gone before. But we are to think now at this point about the conceivable relationship between the use of the hallucinogenic drugs, this family of drugs, and the religious experience. Dr. Alpert last evening suggested that his experience was a re-experience of that one of the Buddha, or possibly of the experience subjectively of Christ. I'd like to contend with 2 points this morning. First of all, the nature of the religious experience which is in question here, which is allegedly involved in the LSD ingestion, and conceivably the number of students or the percentage of students whom we may guess are using LSD for this purpose or are using the vocabulary of mysticism as a subterfuge and a rationalization for their otherwise motivated activity. At least because of the fact that the religious experience has been stated so many times with relationship to LSD, it would be incredibly naive of us to pass off this particular aspect of the hallucinogenic drug and the psychedelic movement as a fad or a phase and simply discount the claim of religious experience. For one reason, the use of the toxic plant substances, as you know, to induce some mystic feeling for communion with the gods, for meditation, is not just a new fad. It has been known in primitive societies for a millennia. Peyote, as has been described for you, has been used by the Indians of the southwest United States for generations, a substance which they call teo nanakatil, or God's flesh, clearly represents for them a rite, the equivalent of a communion rite. In Mexico, the crowning of Montezuma was accompanied by a mushroom rite, a religious ceremony. And in the area of the Rio Grande, the use of peyote buttons or dried cactus plants, as you know, has become the focal ritual of a religious sect identified since 1918 as the Native American Church. The cry of a psychedelic religion, consequently, is scarcely a new one. I think our primary dilemma in approaching this question is inherent in the very definition of what constitutes a, quote, religious experience. This is a matter, I would suggest, of one's concept of notion of faith. But faith itself is a chameleon among human phenomena. It can mean many things. It can mean the assent to a series of propositions, or it can mean the more personalistic assent to a person, as in the case of one's belief in the person Jesus Christ, or Buddha, or Muhammad. As an assent or a response, faith is in some way observable. But as a purely subjective experience, it is precisely private and unobservable. Dr. R.D. Lang, author of several remarkable books, The Divided Self and The Self and Others, describes our customary notion of faith as the scientifically indefensible belief in an untested hypothesis, or as the belief in a reality which is not evident. St. Paul, of course, says that faith is the proof of realities we do not see. Now, this, I believe, is the sense in which we commonly use the word. The dilemma arises precisely when the believer states flatly that his faith has become empirically verified by some personal experience of what hitherto was not evident. At that point, faith is no longer a belief in the obscure or untested, you see, but it becomes a personal encounter with that which was previously unknown. The cloud of unknowing, which is a constant mystic phrase, as you know, which hung over the ascent to the untested, has been lifted. Now, there are many instances of this movement from the faith of the unknowing to the faith of vision in Christian literature, and it's this that I would like to attend to. Paul of Tarsus, for example, was thrown to the ground and blinded for 3 days. And in that direct experience, his faith became a vision which itself tested the unknowable, in which the unknown became somehow known. Now, it'll be in this latter sense of the faith becoming a vision, of a direct experience, that I shall use the word faith and religious experience interchangeably. In a much more popular sense, which I intend to reject, at least in the context of this paper, religious experience or faith can be identified with the membership in some institutional church. Such membership implies the exercise of a religious ritual proper to the sect, and on this level, there may be no question at all of any subjective religious experience. The ritual itself is the criterion of faith, whether the ritual be regarded as real or symbolic. Righteousness, or the sense of salvation, is guaranteed by the ritual, and the feeling of righteousness, of sanctification or salvation in the individual is itself the religious experience. Now, I think we could agree that the history of the psychological aberrations which have been attendant upon such a belief in one's own righteousness, the Phariseeism, the hypocrisy, and the sins that have been committed in the name of religion, can leave little doubt about the validity or lack of validity of this concept of faith. Ingmar Bergman, in so many films, has repeated, I think, among other themes, this one, that righteousness kills innocence just as surely as passion does. Is it not rather ironic that we have so tragically obscured the actual message and vision of Christ that students now must turn away from Christianity to discover precisely what Christ was talking about? It was precisely the work of Christ to translate the ritual repetition into some interior experience. And so we're here primarily concerned with religious experience insofar as it is an interior one. At the risk of what I am sure is unbelievable prematurity, I should like to introduce some operational definition of religious experience, as I mean it in this paper. I've drawn the definition from many different studies, from William James to Stace to the writings of the mystics themselves, Meister Eckhart, Teresa of Avila, and so on. It corresponds in large part to a doctoral thesis published at Harvard in 1962 by Dr. Walter Pankey, entitled Drugs and Mysticism, too. The first characteristic of the religious experience is the sense of oneness, of unity, of brotherhood, of a kind of cosmic togetherness. The empirical ego, in the sense in which we have been using it in this conference, which includes the patterns of our behavior, the ways one learns to cope with the environment, the defenses which one throws up against the environment, all are dropped in favor of an awareness of the inner world. Inner awareness generates what the mystics describe as the all-is-one feeling. One becomes identified with the inner self, the almost impenetrable core of the self, which for most of us remains shrouded in mystery through the majority of our lives. Of this experience of unity via meditation, the existential philosopher Karl Jaspers writes, "A larger and more comprehensive self emerges. I could abandon the previous personality with its entire entourage. A new life began for me, and from now on I felt different from other people. The self that consisted of conventional lies, of shams, of self-deceptions, of memory images, a self just like that of other people, remained in me, but behind and above it stood a greater and more comprehensive self, which impressed me with something of what is eternal, unchanging, immortal. Words that are not altogether dissimilar to the verbal reports of the religious devotees of LSD. For the individual in the quest of the transcendental self, of which Jaspers is talking, there is a movement in which the center of experience veers away from the ego, which mediates between the self and the outside world, into the self. And for this reason, the usual boundaries between the self and the non-self are lost. And it is out of this loss of those boundaries that one experiences the sense of unity. A second operational characteristic of the religious experience is the quality of insight and omnipotence. There is, in the experience, a direct, intuitive, non-conceptual experience of the self, which leads to an absolute certainty that the experience does reveal what is profoundly real, and that all other previous empirical experiences are less real, even perhaps illusory. We reach beneath the games to find what is ultimately and primitively real. And the insight, of course, leads to a feeling of great power. Who could suggest to Paul of Tarsus, after his violent encounter with the divine, that he had not really met what was real, and that his profound personal experience still needed further scientific verification? In the experience itself, there is the power that comes from the sense of ultimate reality. A further quality of the religious experience is the transcendence of space and time. These dimensions become virtually meaningless for the duration of the experience. The subject of the experience tends to feel that of a sudden he stands outside of time, in eternity or infinity, beyond both the past and the future. And incidentally, in his this is remarked by Dr. Stace, an extraordinary commentator on mystic life, in terms of his own experience this way: from the perspective of the timeless, I could see my life in retrospect and in prospect. It was as if it had all been lived through before, as if we had all been here before and would be here again. And incidentally, in his presentation at the Santa Monica Civic Auditorium, Timothy Leary began his happening with the words, "We have all been here before." Dr. Alpert last night described the sense of the compression of time in the drug experience. Time and space, of course, require some identification with the world around one, and with the loss of that identification through the functioning of the empirical ego, the feelings of time and space are also lost. Throughout both Christian and the Oriental mysticism, there is always a sense also of sacredness, a silent, hesitant response to the presence of some inspiring value, as was expressed in Rudolf Otto's term, the mysterium tremendum. In specifically Christian writings, one finds this in the literature of the sacraments. The original Greek, after all, for the word sacrament was the word mysterion, or mystery. And it is precisely in the sacrament that the divine and the material are fused, and one encounters the two in one. And this encounter with the divine through matter reduces from the subject a sense of awe and reverence, which is the prelude to worship. Accompanying the sense of sacredness, of course, is a very positive feeling of joy, of love, peace. The peace may be quiet, or it might rise to an intense form resembling some kind of psychological climax. It is the peace which surpasseth understanding, as much of the Christian literature has it. Anxiety is dispelled, and there is a feeling of relaxation. And in milder form, it can be described as a kind of quiet tenderness. In a rather different vein, the modes of thinking during the experience, mystic experience, are said to be altered. Once again, the removal from the restrictions of the immediate physical environment and the testing of that environment make it possible for the mind to swing through empirically untestable realms, Contradictions, for example, which of course are rendered impossible in the physical world, are conceivable within a purely conceptual, dialectical world. You will recall that in Hegel's idealistic world of thought, there is a coexistence of contradictory ideas. And so in the world of the inner self, there is a kind of paralogic that violates all of the Aristotelian categories, and yet seems at the moment to be, to the subject at least, to be eminently logical and sensible. One in the mystic experience can claim, for example, to live and die at the same time. One can speak about being in the body and out of the body at the same time. In violent forms of psychopathology, too, something of the same process is described, especially by Dr. Arrietty in his work on schizophrenia, as a paleological framework. The individual can think that he is both Lyndon Johnson and Jesus Christ at the same time, because these concepts, somewhat unreconcilable in the empirical world, can coexist comfortably in the inner world. Finally, the religious experience can be described as one in which there is a conviction of the ineffability, the unspeakableness of the experience. Thomas Aquinas remarks that having attended the great banquet, the mystic experience, the agape or love feast, one finds oneself incapable of telling anyone else about it. The experience, so intimate, so deep, so private, defies verbal description. There are no words to describe it. Words kill it. All that one can say is, "Come and see." This characteristic, of course, can be rather enormously exasperating to the listener who would like to have some description of the package before buying it. Generally speaking, the experience is transient, lasting perhaps a few hours or a few seconds. It can lead also to some discernible positive changes in the attitude of the mystic, the religious, toward himself, toward others, toward life, and toward the experience itself. It seems to create greater sensitivity to others, increased tolerance, and more real compassion in one's relationship with other persons. By this I'm referring largely to the interpersonal phenomena that Martin Buber describes as the I-thou relationship, in which the encounter with another person takes place without the subtle and not so subtle masks that generally separate man from man. Well, so much for the operational definition of the religious experience. This obviously very cursory description of the religious experience that I have drawn mostly from the literature of spontaneous mysticism in the West. Now, the language of our neo-mystics of today is principally drawn from the mysticism of the East, of the Hindu, the Guru, the Buddha, and I feel somewhat at a loss here because both time and my own ignorance of a good portion of Eastern mysticism precludes the possibility of including that at any length in the description. However, through the categories described, there appears to be one consistent thread. All of these describe an experience of the loss of one's normal ego functioning and one's normal ego relationships with the environment. Ego, in the Freudian sense, the mediating force between libidinal erotic drives and the environment, is the instrument for living in this world. And if the ego is broken up or destroyed, then the person is exposed to the inner world. And the ego loss involves the reduction of reality testing, the dropping away of learned patterns of responses to people and things, and often, hopefully, the lowering also of the defensive patterns of handling the environment. Now, the very fascinating phenomenon here is that the ego loss experience is characteristic not only of mystic writings, as described above, but also of the psychotic condition and of the verbal reports about the drug-induced experience. It is for this reason that Timothy Leary can say, for example, and I believe with exceptional insight, that we do not rightly understand psychoticism because we do not understand mysticism. The psychotic, because the environment is altogether overwhelming for him, chooses to withdraw into the inner world where he is omnipotent, where he need not painfully check his thoughts against the world outside, and where he is safe. For him, however, the experience may not be transient, as it is for the mystic, and the self which he reaches may be fearful and frightened. But the change in logical thinking, the loss of reality testing, the feeling of being momentarily at sea, are all part of the psychotic episode, as they seem to be part of the religious mystical experience. And lastly, to the degree that one can accept the verbal reports of the psychedelic community, here also is something of the same ego loss, which allows the mind-expanding qualities of which we read so very much of the psychedelic drug. In order to come to the religious experience, one must blow one's mind, in the jargon. And this, of course, is based on verbal report. Experiments have been done in an attempt to verify subjective report of these subjects who claim that they have experienced some mystic awareness by ingestion of LSD and similar drugs. One of these was by Dr. Pankey at Harvard in 1962, who worked with a rather small group of subjects, given an experimental drug, in this case psilocybin, and a placebo as a control drug. An item questionnaire of 140 items designed specifically to measure the experimental variables, which were 9 categories of mysticism, somewhat similar to the ones that I have outlined, was constructed. The questionnaire was presented to the subjects within a week of their LSD experience, and the questionnaire, plus written accounts of the subjects of what they had experienced during the time, constituted the experimental scale on which changes in the direction of mystic awareness were to be recorded. The scores of the experimental subjects on this scale proved to be statistically significantly in the direction of the experimental hypotheses, except for the category of the sense of sacredness. The conclusion from this study was that the experience of the hallucinogenic drug was behaviorally similar to the operational categories of mystic consciousness as we described them. Dr. McLaughlin's study, which he alluded to last evening briefly, a much more detailed experiment, was also carried out, in which McLaughlin was not so much concerned with the experimental testing of the religious experience, but rather with those personality variables which very significantly might be intimately related to what we would call a predisposition or set for a religious experience. And these variables included lower anxiety level, less egocentric defensiveness, increased creativity, and increased interest in aesthetics. The hypotheses in Dr. McLaughlin's experiment were supported, but not with statistical significance. But these studies, as others in the same area, and there are several others, seem generally to support the fact that with those people who are in some way predisposed or ready for a religious experience, and I should like to underscore that aspect of it, the readiness for the religious experience, there can be an experience by the ingestion of an hallucinogenic drug which is in many respects similar to the classically described mystical awareness. One must, of course, as so many authors have noted, consider the set and the setting in determining specifically the LSD reaction. Dr. McLaughlin, in his paper to the American Psychological Association last September, noted 2 kinds of sets. First, a semi-permanent lifestyle, and second, a more changeable motivational element depending upon the physical surrounding and so forth. What we are concerned with here is the lifestyle, the predisposition for a religious experience under the effect of the drug. Even if a religious experience, as here defined, is possible through acid ingestion, I almost said acid indigestion, not everyone is disposed to have one. The resemblances between the religious experience as here defined, the psychotic process, and the psychedelic experience pose what I conceive to be an enormously pregnant research question. What are the similarities and dissimilarities in the ego experience as reported by mystics, psychotics, and acid heads? Some similarities we've already noted. I think you can make the adjustment to the LSD experience readily. The dissimilarities would appear to rest upon the person's readiness for religious experience, whatever that may be. We know precious little of this. To my knowledge, the extent research on this is extremely slim. A few interested students and I at Loyola are initiating a review of mysticism and of the Romantic literature, hopeful to develop some research hypotheses, some concrete research hypotheses in this area. Now, this, of course, in turn is part of a much larger question about the diagnosis between mystical experiences on the one hand and similar forms of psychopathology on the other. For example, is the asceticism of the Hindu fakir or the yen for martyrdom of the early Christian ascetic, is it a form of violent self-punitive masochism, or does it really constitute the heights of a religious experience? What are the relationships between what are called the heights and the depths of human experience? Research into the relationships between the ego loss experience of the mystic, the psychotic, and the acid head could, I think, contribute considerably to this fascinating problem which lies in the nether world between religion and psychiatry. There is one moral question that I should like to raise. I guess I feel traditionally obliged to raise some moral question. I have, in a sense, alluded to it before, and I think it has been implicitly suggested in some of the comments last evening. Apart from the usual moral questions of what our stance should be before the odd and inconsistent patchwork of laws that we now have in this state, there is a moral issue of a rather more personal sense, I think. Is it in the best interest of the personal spiritual growth of the individual to obtain by drug ingestion the effects, the transient experiences of something like a mystic awareness, which one would suggest are best secured by prolonged and arduous meditation and sometimes by painful self-discovery? Can one, in a word, properly synthesize the experience of the mystics? What may be the long-range social and personal effects of what Dr. Alpert had called a crutch last evening, and the prolonged reliance on it for what one should be doing perhaps by dint of his own arduous soul-searching? I have no way of responding to that question. What I have tried to say suggests in general that what has recently appeared in this new psychedelic religious tonality, a new and exciting dimension in the quest for God. The awareness of the presence of God and the presence of the self, the awareness of the presence of the self, have become fused. The dualistic splitting of God and self has begun to vanish. I have, for example, myself heard not a few priests, rabbis, and ministers in our sensitivity sessions with them, which we operate now. They have remarked that although they had made many spiritual exercises of one kind or another, they had never had a religious experience quite like this one. Now one wonders, how can men in this capacity, sincere, honest, devoted, religious men, derive from a self-awareness experiment or a drug-induced experience without any explicit mention of God or religion? How can this be called properly a religious experience? And I should like to return to that question in a moment. There is a more immediate question, of course, and the one in which I presume you have more pressing interest, which concerns the percentage of our college acid heads who do in fact enjoy such a religious experience through LSD. How many can be said to have the predisposition, the lifestyle, the psychological readiness for an experience which requires of the mystics years of disciplined meditation and practice? Clearly, we have no statistics on this point. For what it is worth, I am convinced from my own experience of working with many in small group sensitivity sessions that many do. But I cannot substantiate that either. In any event, in the candor and in the honesty and mutually critical atmosphere of the sensitivity group, the genuine religious experience and the thrill-seeking experience quickly emerge in very, very sharp contrast. Differentiating between them at that point is not, in this context, a very difficult task. Indeed, we are in no way sure of what contributes to such a predisposition. And on the other hand, how many students are using the vocabulary of mysticism without the experience itself. I'm sure, at this point at least, as in so many other areas in which we are forced always to make individual prudential judgments in the context of an individual case, that the student personnel officer or counselor must decide in each case. Nothing, unfortunately, can relieve him of the pain of individual judgment here. There is simply not enough evidence to absolutize any norms for judgments, even if that were considered desirable, which I earnestly doubt. But suffice it to say that the claim of a mind-expanding religious experience as a function of the ingestion of LSD or any of the hallucinogenic family of drugs can by no means be discounted as it has been, and I quote, as sheer bunk. To return to the awareness of God and the awareness of self, I should like to close by saying that I have a suspicion, as Dr. Robinson states in Honest to God, that we have come a rather long way in our search for God. Traditionally, we looked for God out there somewhere, for a distant God who perhaps took a benign and occasional interest in us, and we found him, symbolically, on the mountain, the traditional holy place, the Mount of the Tables, the Mount of Sion. By no accident that the Sermon on the Mount is thusly described. This God out there easily became historically the God of law, because he was the supreme lawgiver who handed down the laws, or identified with authority simply. But this kind of God is not really livable. So we then looked for God in others. Upon Christ's suggestion that what you do to the least of my little ones you do to me, we sought him in others and in the service of others. But in the ethic of service, we also found ourselves filled with a good amount of self-deception. How can we be sure that we did not need those whom we helped more than they need us? C.S. Lewis has a rather delightful phrase about a social worker who was renowned for her service of others. And he remarks, "She helps many, many people. Indeed, you can tell all of the people whom she has helped by their hunted expressions." Finally, we are searching now for God in that place where we might well have been looking for him all the while, where indeed the mystics, prophets, have searched deep within ourselves. There, in the recesses and mysteries of the self, we may best find what we have always implicitly known was there, and have described as being there in the image of ourself. There, in the deep part of ourself, we might find what we have traditionally called the imago Dei, the image of God. Whatever brings us into genuine, honest contact with the self might well bring us into contact with God, however we describe him. This is not to say that this route does not have self-deceptions of its own, or that indeed God is not to be found in the other places as well, but only that this search has exciting possibilities, and I suggest we risk it. We live, after all, in a very secularized world. I use that instead of secular world in deference to Dr. Cox. In great part, we have lost our experience of the Spirit. And in the place of that experience, that direct experience of the Spirit, we are asked to have faith, a faith in what is not there. There is a prophecy in the prophet Amos about a famine. Not, he says, Amos, a famine for bread, nor a thirst for water, but a famine for hearing the words of God. It may be that that famine is with us, that we are surfeited with the secular, and that there is a new hunger for the spiritual, and that we are at the point where faith may become vision. Thank you.
I should like to introduce the members of this panel who are deans of students and will have an opportunity to react. I should point out that It has been said that the president of a college or university is like the shepherd of a flock, and the dean is the crook upon which he leans. We have four deans here who will react to what has been discussed during these very busy hours. Dean Arlie Williams from the University of California is substituting for Dean Atkinson from UCLA. This is Dean Williams to my immediate right. Father William Perkins, the Vice President, Student Services from Santa Clara University on the far right. On my immediate left is Dr. George Demas, who has been the program chairman for this conference. George is Dean of Students at California State College at Long Beach. And Mr. Don Sirianni, Dean of Academic Affairs, Cerritos Junior College at Norwalk. It may be that these gentlemen have met together and decided the format. I don't know if you want to go alphabetically. How do you want to do this? Who wants to be the cast the first stone? Arlie?
Arlie.
I think we'll call on Arlie Williams to kick things off. We know Arlie is a very successful man. He's one who always comes out on top, and so we'll hear from Arlie first.
Well, I have several reactions, and some of them at this moment are quite personal. I've been able to sit back and absorb what I've considered to be a very magnificent conference. 2 minutes ago, a very gracious friend, a wonderful friend of mine said, "You're going to substitute for me." So now I find myself in the spot of having to think a little bit, and that's very difficult. Thank you, Barney. My friend Henry Bruin treated me improperly. I didn't ask Henry what we did about bananas. I want to know how many bananas a person would have to smoke to be able to get a psychedelic experience. And he couldn't tell me. So he was not any more of an expert than I was. But if you thought that that was a facetious remark, it was not, because we did have a smoking session on the steps of Sproul Hall on Thursday. 2 youngsters who were in our experimental program, undoubtedly very bright, had their picket signs out there, or signs to indicate that they were smoking bananas. And I don't know whether it was for our benefit or just exactly what kind of a protest they were expecting. But I was not about to ride my white Charger out to the steps of Sproul Hall and raise the issue of bananas at this time. I must admit that I left Berkeley primarily with gratification to be able to get away from Berkeley for a while. I was not overly enthusiastic about coming to a conference because, very honestly, I'm not a conference person. But I've been extremely impressed and pleased with all that I've heard at this conference. I respect the depth of statements given by each person. I respect the latitude it covered, because I think we've been able to obtain a beautiful presentation, and as a result of this, we may not be experts by having attended this, but at least I think we are somewhat more knowledgeable and perhaps a little bit more capable of handling some of the jobs we have to handle. It, I think, reinforced my own opinion and feeling that the utilization of psychedelic drugs or specific drugs is a part of life, and it is a reality for some individuals. I'm convinced that we as people must recognize that we are working with all people, and that we respect these people, and we respect the sanctity of a human being. We may not agree with what they do, and perhaps if we are capable, we have a responsibility of helping them to challenge themselves so they may determine in what direction they wish to go. I agree very definitely with the young people who spoke this morning, who stated that we cannot tell, because I think the minute that we begin to attempt to tell somebody, and the minute that perhaps we think that we can impose a formula of life upon other people, we may become dangerous. And I think I might challenge them in the same direction. I had one question that I wanted to ask, did not ask it, but I will now as long as I have the microphone. If the utilization of drugs is a religious experience, or if it is an experience through which we can understand the meaning of love, and if it is an experience by which we can practice the meaning of love, why would we discredit a sorority girl for being shallow? And why would we discredit a man who makes $200 rather than $100 per week? I think that each one of us in this instance perhaps must understand the other. And that if we can implement the meaning of love, then I think this world is going to be so much better. I've rambled, and you fellows have put me on a spot. I hope that I might be able to get a chance for rebuttal if somebody begins to attack me, but that's about all I can say at this moment.
Perhaps the first comment which I might make is to repeat an opinion, of course, that I've had for a long time, which Father Weber reinforced. I'm not a mystic, but he has reminded us of a very interesting area, which I think will grow and develop in education. There was a period in the history of education, higher education in the United States, when religious education seemed to be just the prerogative of the religious-oriented school, but today we find springing up all over the country many departments of religion and religious education courses in state universities. And I think that what Father Weber indicates right now is a pretty virgin area in the line of exploration and investigation will perhaps broaden out and spread over a great part of the country so that we might be able to do some real scientific investigation into the nature of religious experience and how man seeks God. So I think we have really an interesting era to look forward to, in which many more schools will share in this search for God. I think oftentimes that we as deans of students come together more pushed by a certain agitation that surrounds our office, sort of a worry about the law. I wonder if this conference, or the one in Washington, would have taken place if there hadn't been that agitation. That's always with us. In other words, how do we stand in regards to the law? Helen Nolis at the first conference we had in Washington brought up that subject, and she recommended that perhaps we tackle it. We didn't at Washington. We really haven't tackled it here, and I'm not going to tackle it. But we come together with really a sort of a dilemma, facing a dilemma. Where do we stand in regard to the law? And our students want to know this, and the faculty wants to know it. And then we have the other area, the other side of the picture, how do we function as educators? I think that we really do have to face the issue of where we stand with the law. It's a hard decision to make. It's a policy decision. It's a university decision. But it's so hard to do this, at least it is for me, and then face individual students with very genuine, sincere problems. It's the same thing with drinking. We all know the law, and yet we all face many problems with regard to drink that students bring to us or that reach our desk. So it's a very hard position to be in, and I don't think we've resolved it. I'd like to hear it discussed sometime. Is there a resolution? Can you make a resolution within the office of the Dean of Students? Of course, the longer I'm at it, the more frequently I suggest to our president that we adopt the system that many European schools have, that we offer classroom space, teachers, and a library, and forget the rest of it. But that's not very practical, I guess. He doesn't buy it anyway, except when he looks at the annual budget. So I would like to just at least suggest that area, that we face that dilemma. how we stand in regard to the law, and then what role we will play as educators. I think this conference has made us very much aware of how much needs to be done in the line of education, just as the last generation faced the problems of sex education, how it has gone down through the grades and is now, I don't know what grade they begin teaching sex education, but it keeps dropping year by year. Well, maybe we'll find that we must move much faster in the area of drug education. That instead of worrying about what should we be teaching our students about narcotics and drugs, that this will be done at a much earlier period in their education. And finally, of course, how far will a pluralistic society such as ours allow us to go in tolerating various beliefs and attitudes? Right now, society is somewhat intolerant of the drug picture. But again, that's no answer, and we again face the tensions that a pluralistic society are always faced with. How much will it tolerate? And as the years go on, as understanding increases about drugs and the problems of narcotics, will our understanding broaden? Will we be more tolerant? I'm just really raising questions, not any answers. And of course, we all know what a terrific amount of patience it will take to see us through the next decade or more. The experience of rebellion, of course, doesn't just happen between students and adults. It's going on to some extent, say, within the church. I don't know if the older members of the Jesuit order look upon the younger ones as acid heads in the religious sense, but there's a certain conflict and tension that's going on there that is very similar to the tension that goes on between a younger generation and an older generation. And of course, it just takes a fantastic amount of patience to see a problem like this through. And with that, I'll just stop.
Thanks, Bill. I have several feelings. I have 2 weeks ago, I would have given a different talk than I'm giving now. The reason I say that is I had the privilege of participating in a marathon sensitivity group session, which was unquestionably the most profound experience I had had in my life. And as Father Weber has indicated, it had many similarities to the experiences that many people say that they get when they take LSD, or many religious mystical experiences. And as a result of this experience, I think it made a deep impact on me, because the kind of talk I would have given, I don't think I would have been communicating, and I hope I'm communicating now, or will at least as I continue. I would have given a very verbal, glib, articulate kind of talk, well prepared, well thought out, but it wouldn't have had the feeling that I'm feeling right now. And I'd like to share that with you a little bit, because I think this is where we fall down as administrators. We have many constituencies in our job. We deal with other administrators, faculty, parents, the Board of Trustees, and I think we do a fairly good job with this kind of intellectualism, the games in terms of the right words and phrases and so forth. But we've really lost, I think, and done a very inadequate job in dealing with the so-called hippies, in dealing with the activist students, the students who are really challenging us. In fact, as I look at my schedule during the day, I find myself being deluged with attendance at meetings, and as a dean of students, I find myself, if I'm not careful, rarely talking with students, not at students, because I think so many of us have been taught through the monologue, we don't know what the dialogue really is. And I think this is what these students were telling us today. At least I got this feeling. It's important for us to communicate. Now, it's a good word, I know, but communicate at a different level, in a different way, at a feeling level. Cut out all this bullshit, is what they said to me at the marathon session, and tell me the way you really feel. What are you feeling? And cut out all the phoniness and the facades and the barriers that are separating us. And I think this is what the students are saying to us too. And it has a tremendous impact on me, because I feel as though I have been part of that game and playing that game, the game that wasn't really with the students and communicating with them. And I would like to propose that these sensitivity groups that Father Weber was talking about and the marathon that I happen to go through can be tremendous and profound experiences which can be adequate substitutes, I think, for LSD and other psychedelic drugs. I think that, and perhaps these experiences are less painful, less dangerous. I think they are. I think we need to explore them to a much greater degree than we have. In fact, we're doing it on our campus. We're already exploring ways in which we can conduct more sensitivity sessions, more marathons, with students, with faculty, with police officers, on our campus, with administrators. How can we really communicate with students in a way that's meaningful to them, that builds trust, something that we see existing in a very small portion, at least, on many campuses. And I think this is not unique or atypical. I think this exists in campuses throughout the country. So this is something that all of us need to explore, the role of other modalities, which perhaps aren't as dangerous, potentially dangerous, as drugs are. The modality of the marathon, I think, is potentially one of the most significant. I think in doing this, you're going to run into some difficulty, as we have already run into difficulty with the press, as Dr. Brune has mentioned. This is a sensational thing. The concept of drugs, the idea of students using drugs, can frequently be widely misinterpreted, and headlines blazing across newspapers, as happened in our town, Long Beach, recently, when they got wind of a drug study that we were conducting. 50% of the students at Cal State Long Beach taking illicit drugs. Right next to it was a picture of a young girl, scantily dressed. Wasn't a student, but the image was there. Top across the upper headline was a statement that said, 7 nabbed in vice raid. But here were these gigantic, horrendous headlines which said that 50% of the students were using illicit drugs, which was far from the truth. And as you read the article, you'll see that there was a small article about the fact that we were conducting a study, attempting to find out how many students were utilizing drugs on our campus. And if you read the article, it was a far cry from the headline. Well, this kind of sensationalism will happen on many of your campuses, I'm sure. And it's something that we need to be aware of and prepared for. The man who got the story was a very responsible editor, a science and medicine editor. He was a man who I had a great deal of regard for. But I understand that headline writers are completely autonomous. And if they get a story and see it and they think it'll sell papers, they can make a headline regardless of who wrote the article, regardless of the editor's stance. The next day, an editorial was written which was attempting to explain that you shouldn't jump to conclusions on the basis of one headline and so on and so forth, but the damage in many cases had already been done. Well, this kind of sensationalism, I think, is something that scares us. It frightens us from really digging in and understanding the problem. We're more likely to repress it and suppress it and keep it down and hope that it'll go away. And I think to some degree this is what we've done on our campus, and I think on other campuses as well. We don't have a drug problem, I hear many deans saying when I talk with them. I think in many cases they're simply not aware of it, or they're suppressing it, or they're unlikely or unwilling to look at it realistically because they're frightened. They're frightened of this kind of publicity, the sensationalism, what they might uncover, the fact that the students who perhaps are grilling and questing and challenging are very, very difficult students indeed to deal with, to discuss these particular problems with. And we're hoping that we can push them aside, repress them, if you will. And I don't feel the students will let us get by with it. They're confronting us, they're asking us, they're quizzing us, they're challenging us in many different ways. And I propose that groups like the sensitivity groups, the marathon groups in particular, will be the media, or one of the media, in which we can bring all of these disparate bodies together, because I don't think they're as different or as disparate as they appear right now. As Richard was talking this morning, and as the students were up here this morning, I felt that I haven't been able to communicate to the students that I'm really with them. And I really sincerely mean this. In fact, when I was a student, I was just like them, I think. In fact, in many cases, I hope I was, because I saw many qualities that I really admire in these students. But I haven't been able to communicate this. They're still suspicious of me. I'm a member of the establishment. I've sold out. They don't really trust me. And it becomes incumbent on me to convince them, to discuss with them the fact that I really understand, or I'm trying to understand their point of view, their perspective. And, Don?
Well, I guess I'll be the villain. When I was asked, excuse me, when I was asked to participate, they said, you're going to represent the establishment. So I did prepare some notes, and after sitting here and being thrashed around the head for 2 days, I want to react to a lot of things. If you'll pardon a personal reference, because occasionally I have to do this with my students, unless you have lived, you can't really understand. The only thing I can do is refer back that I have lived. I went through the schools in Willowbrook, which was part of the Watts situation. I attended 2 years at Compton Junior College, which is predominantly non-white. So when I speak, and our college is in the shadow of one of the largest state hospitals, Norwalk, a lot of our staff participate, and we have an opportunity to observe the effects of these things. I can't help, though, disagreeing with some of my colleagues here, and I'm famous for getting myself in trouble. So here I go. Let's take a definition of a dean that's been thrown around as a meeting in San Francisco. What is a dean in this academic climate? They say the faculty is paid to think, the president is paid to make speeches, and the dean is paid to keep the faculty from making speeches and the president from thinking. I wonder what a dean of students is supposed to do with the students. We try to provide activities for them to speak. But the impact of this conference on me has shown how little I really know about one of the great problems that society faces. But I am also aware that society, as always, as you study the history of higher education, and this is where the philosophy comes in, when the family and the church and the state cannot solve a problem, where do they turn? To the educational institutions. And we see a greater log being put on the wagon to help us with this problem. So we must prepare ourselves. I think the community college is this salvation. I've been with them for 15 years. It has truly become a partner of higher education in the last, well, since World War II. And this community college, I think, and some of my colleagues in the university will be a little bit sensitive to what I say, I think maybe I can pinpoint some of your problems, at least the communication we get back from our students. The transition from high school, which is a regimented climate, to this so-called ultimate freedom. And some of them cannot adjust to it. Call it social immaturity or whatever you want. We do a little bit of weaning. Some of my students say, well, you keep them for 2 years, you fan them, you get them on fire, and then you dump them on us. And then they lead these crusades and these marches. Well, I don't accept that. The makeup of our student body is one that I think is more complex. I think you have it really a lot easier than we, in that you have basically put up screening devices by the master plan of higher education to be selective. The state law says we must take anyone that's 18 years of age or a high school graduate and can benefit by instruction. Now, how do you prove they can benefit by instruction? Not by tests, not by previous grades. You give them a program. Can they succeed? Do they maintain a C average in our college? If not, we say you're not benefiting and we have to dismiss them. So we have on our college, on our campus anyways, in most community colleges, that student that's proven himself academically, and I guess the very near future we'll have most of the lower division. We'll have that student that was not qualified, but all of a sudden he's developed into what I call a need to know. He's no longer has to be told that I need this course. Society has indicated without the degree you cannot go on. And so he's on our campus trying to qualify, and I think this is the very main purpose of our function as a community college, to provide that program for him to qualify for the state college. Then we have the technical person. That individual is just trying to have a job entry level. The latest thing and the greatest fad, and that's why we've changed our name now to community colleges. We're obligated to provide a program for those people that aren't even formally enrolled. So you think you have student problems? Look at our campuses with 11,000 people with this diverse background, all wanting needs satisfied. If one of the main functions of higher education is the transmission of our culture, I think all of us are doing a poor job. This conference, to me, has caused me to go back and evaluate. We spend too much time waiting until there's a problem, wait till the place is on fire, then write a rule or regulation, hide behind the law, and then expect to solve it. We should provide the in-service training, understand the characteristics of the students that we have. What kind of in-service training do we participate in on most campuses? Very little. Student personnel people do not provide, I don't think, enough information to the faculty to really understand the student. And I'm sure that if a member of our community were to ask, do you provide any training in drugs, as has been asked of us, I can hold up some documents that are available. This is by the State Department, the Attorney General's office. I just received another letter that the Bureau of Drug Abuse Control every 2 months will send out a letter. Here's one on a bootleg LSD laboratory. These will be mailed out. So I can reach and grab this file and say, this is what we have. But in reality, because we all have health education as a requirement, where is the darn thing taught? With all due respect to the people in the physical education department. It's taught by the physical education department, and invariably it will be a man that his main objective is to provide a winning team, and so the preparation that he might go through for this very important unit on drugs may be not doing the job. Or the old adage or the definition of formal education that I've heard recently. That's when we teach many of our courses, as I look at them. It goes from the faculty's notebook to the student's notebook, and it never passes through either one's head. We test on facts, and there's no discussion. It's just presenting cold, hard facts. I'm going to have to hurry along here now. Got so many anxieties that I want to share with you that it's tough to... The other thing that bothered me was a question that was asked, and I noticed the speaker that preceded us said, well, how do you answer a student? I hope, like everything, we don't go to conferences to get answers, specific answers that all of us can parrot back. We talk about the uniqueness of our institutions. I know as I sit on articulation agreements when we talk about why in the world don't you all accept Life Science 10? Oh, our institution is unique, we need this, and so on. And we always preach uniqueness. And yet, when we go to a conference, we want a stock reply to a answer or a problem sometimes, rather than saying, this is unique. All right, I'm an educated person. My obligation is to evaluate it. One thing that I think that we don't do to the students, do for the students, and that is indicate to them why we're there. We've got an obligation to support the so-called establishment. What is the philosophy of higher education in the state? What is the philosophy of your institution? Why are they there? What is our obligation to the community? What is our obligation to all the students? And I kind of question, as I meet with my students, when they say, the students want. It's just like when we make reference here, the administration. All of us are administration. Teachers right on up the top. You've got to administer and interpret rules and regulations. You've also got to provide the climate for them to grow in. We've had these conferences, these seminars. Some of the students will come up and they'll say, you know, the students want. And I said, fine, then we have dead hours on our campus. Anything goes. You bring in your group. And you want to see how many people show up. Sure, some of them might say they're afraid. But I doubt that on our campus because most of them feel quite free to say as they please. But again, I don't believe we have defined what the establishment is. Students rebel against the establishment. They don't know what it is. And I think many times they say the students want. They don't know what the students want. They know what their one little group wants. And our obligation, I guess, is to evaluate the needs of all. That's why we're there. But we don't have to modify all of our program, which I think a lot of universities and colleges are doing in order to avoid bad press. Like the lieutenant said, all of a sudden they're short-manded, and so what do? They have to pour a lot of police officers into one block to quell the disturbance. I think we do the same thing. We find a slight disturbance on our campus, and you unload money and personnel to quiet it down, instead of devoting it to the majority of the students, and what are we really there for? As I indicated, our main function, I think, as I conclude here, is to present factual information and to interpret. If anything the student is to get from his education is to be made aware of, and they hate to be reminded of this, to be responsible for their acts. What are the consequences of their decision? When someone says, is this better than that? My obligation is to provide as much information on both sides as I can. And then they make that decision. Or if they ask my personal opinion, then I'll give it. Students wanted to have programs on our campus that, well, we're really not collegiate unless we can have somebody from up at Berkeley or if we have someone from somewhere else. My feeling is, what do you want to know about? And let's get someone that is really can provide the information, and let's explore it together. And most of them will, and we've had some fairly decent programs, I think. Not emotional, not kinds of reactions to people that we've seen on some of our campuses in the nearby. My obligation is not to provide a program that can cause physical harm or destroy our community, our college, in the eyes of the total community that support us and we serve. But we certainly ought to provide an avenue for them. I think this so-called establishment is not being supported by the professional people that are living in. I think that a lot of us lack courage. Hide behind the law, sure, because that's the easiest thing to do. But to really go out and define what we're there for and hope that the student, he's got his right to his point of view, we've got our rights, and we're going to have to do some compromising on both sides. Well, I've got about umpty-dump other notes here that I can say, but the only thing I can conclude with, I think that mutual trust, student personnel, the charge that I can see as I go back and look at our community is to provide in-service training for our faculty, provide in-service training for the students, and above all, clearly define why we're there.
I'd like to react very briefly to that, and perhaps the rest of us could then do it as well. I think, Don, your point of, excuse me, did you want us? Okay, about 5 minutes. I think your point is a prevalent philosophy that exists on most campuses from public schools on up. And to some degree, I feel, and this is a feeling with me, that you're really missing the boat. You're missing the point. Sure, they understand these regulations, and sure, you've got responsibilities to other constituencies, but I think you're not with the students. And I think you're somewhat, this point of view, I'm not saying you personally, Don, and I know you've got those responsibilities. I have them too. But there's another set of responsibilities that I have too that are very, very important, and perhaps more important than seeing that such and such a regulation is carried out for all students and so on. Now, what I'm rambling here a little bit, but I'm reacting to something that exists on our campus all the time, and I'm sure it exists on yours, where we attempt to bring faculty, administration, and students together. And we find that administrators are usually in a position to talk and frequently talk down to students, instead of really talking with them. In fact, occasionally you'll hear a student tell, or a faculty member or an administrator talk to me. We have a dinner occasionally, not as frequent as we should on our campus, where the faculty and administration are invited over to our residence halls and have dinner with the students. And it's not a rare occurrence for an administrator or faculty member to say to me, "Say, George, what do you say to a student when you're alone with him?" They're so used to lecturing to large masses of students or talking at them that they sincerely didn't know how to respond to a student in his room, alone with him, in a discussion, and kind of on a different kind of situation entirely. Well, this is the kind of, I don't know, software, empathy, approach that I think many of these students are asking for, and they're not able to get it from most of us.
I would like to second very much what George had to say about the results of their sensitivity sessions. The listening to students, and students listening to us, of course, is a terrifically complex problem. A lot of listening just doesn't go on. We have a situation on campus where their students are forming a student-faculty senate, and the 10 elected faculty and the 10 elected students have met in session after session after session, and I find that there's still a great number of students and faculty are not listening to one another. So it's a very difficult thing, and I think you have to go through an experience such as you had to really understand what it means to listen. It's one of the most difficult things that you could ever do. But it's certainly worth every effort that you put into it. And it's only after the listening has begun that you can think about working out solutions to problems. And I think this carries on into the classroom, where, as we all know, a tremendous amount of education is horribly dull. Carl Rogers has written a good deal and talked a good deal about freedom in learning and suggested all sorts of new approaches to classroom education, where there's a lot of self-learning and a lot of listening that goes on between the student and the professor. But I want to re-emphasize, a lot of learning takes place. It isn't just a fresh air, watered-down course, but a lot of what we call humanities is pretty inhumane. And I think students need something like this to fill their lives. Otherwise, what else have a certain percentage of them got to do but experiment and use narcotics, try all sorts of things for kicks that for certain students may not be very good for them. So I think there's a big void in their lives that occurs from a lot of people not listening, and they, of course, admit that they're guilty of the very same thing. They're just as dogmatic as they claim we are, sometimes more so. They don't listen just as we don't listen. So it's a mutual thing that we have to experience. But a lot of it, I think, can be facilitated by introducing into the classroom a much more imaginative approach to education, where this listening to one another goes on there as well as outside of the classroom, and where the humanities, which play a great part in personality development, become more humane. And this is an area, of course, that we have to keep talking about and, again, listening, and listen to people such as Carl Rogers, whose experiments in this area have been very impressive to me.
I think in order to react, just one thing, then I'll keep quiet. I don't want to be misinterpreted what I have said about our obligation to the establishment and to all the students. But I think we're committing a greater crime when we spend a great deal of time, I'm talking about deans of students, spend a great deal of time to try to convince that small element, thinking we're going to gain respect by trying to prove that we're one of them. I think our obligation is that you'll gain respect because you stand on your principles and what you represent, and they're presenting theirs, and you can certainly communicate. I have a feeling that sometimes students feel that they're going to react negatively unless you say yes to them all the time, and as I observe, sometimes the people, when they say no, then immediately you say they turn you out. Well, maybe they do, but they're being as immature, if you want to call it, as we are when we don't listen to them, but they've got to listen to both sides. Secondly, about counseling, I got to make this add one note for your own information. I communicate with our students that go on to the four-year school, and we talk about counseling. We hide behind the rationalization, the community college does the same thing. There's not enough of us, there's not enough money, we do the best job we can, and I don't see a great deal of innovation. But you know the reaction of counseling on a four-year college or university that our kids report back, although you say we spoon feed them a little bit, is that, well, they talk about us as being clients, because I guess it is a prestige thing. He says, I'm not sick, I just want some information. And so you're in a white, purified atmosphere, and unless they're ill, they won't go to you. I think if you can get your counselors to say, I'm a counselor, and you're a student, and let's get together and talk about a simple thing of a poor grade, you certainly need psychological services. But the image that you have, and our students will say, may I come back, and will you assist me at any time I might have a little bit of problem, because I'm not ill. So my last barb. Thank you very much.
I was not going to respond, but I'm afraid I'm going to have to. I hope that we don't try to pigeonhole some responsibilities at various levels of our programs of education. I say this because I've been a dean on the high school level, the junior college level, and the university level. The principles of operation do not differ, no matter where you are. And the responsibility is the same, and the response of human beings is the same to the needs they have. So with that, I close and turn it back to you, Stan.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. We appreciate your comments. Don Albright has an announcement to make before we adjourn for lunch.
I wish to remind you that your programs do not include the group sessions that will be held this afternoon, basically the same as yesterday afternoon. We will try to close these, in fact, plan to close these sessions promptly at 2:45, and they will begin, of course, right after Don Wingegler's remarks about when you return to your campus. The leaders of the discussion group, discussion leaders, will advance one letter, in other words, so that they will not be with the same group they were with yesterday. And then also, Mrs. Neely wanted to remind the moderators again to turn in their reports to her because we have an obligation to be noticed on this matter. The second thing I want to mention is that we will plan to reproduce a list of all the participants in this conference and mail them to you soon after the end of the conference. Also, all of the presentations have been taped, and as soon as we find out what it will cost for you to purchase either all of the conference on tape or a particular speech, this information will be sent to you too, and then you can place your orders directly with the university press relations. Well, this information will be included in what I send you, and also the price and so on. Also, we plan to reproduce one complete tape of the conference, which will be available on a rental or borrowing basis. Again, let me urge you to turn in your final evaluation form before you leave. I think this is a safer procedure than taking it home with you. If you can find the time, please try to fill it out and turn it in before you leave.
And put a number on it, your KIT number.
Oh, yes. Sure, and place your KIT
It's
number.
two personality tests.
It's what good is this? I'm trying to keep tabs. It's bad.
One last word. This is important. Food service is available in the coop. The coop is on level A. Now, if you're trying to get a relationship between the coop and the Bruin, I can't. It's a mixed metaphor of some kind. It's on level A.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to call this final session, or not final, the first session of the final half day to order, please. It's always nice to have been out in the sun, to have an intellectual sunbath, but then there comes that moment of reckoning when you have to be real practical, and what do you do about it now? We will go back to our campuses. You have to make a living somehow, you know, and we will be back on our campuses in a couple of days. What do we do when we return to the campus? Don Windbegler, whom I'm sure all of you know, is going to make this presentation. Dr. Windbegler earned his Ph.D. at the University of Iowa. He has an honorary doctorate degree from Monmouth College. As you know, he has been registrar and professor of speech at Stanford, and for 17 years was the dean of students at Stanford University, and now has been elevated to new position, which I understand is entitled the Academic Secretary to the University. Dr. Don Winbegler.
Thank you, Stan. Ladies and gentlemen, I come before you as a man with a problem. 3 or 4 months ago, it was very easy for me to accept the assignment of attempting to direct your thoughts toward the question of what we're going to do when we return to our home campuses. 3 or 4 days ago, it had become a little more difficult, and 3 or 4 hours ago, it became plainly impossible. The program has made it abundantly clear, I think, that there are no pat answers and no pat programs. It seems a very long time ago, although I guess in fact it was only yesterday morning that Helen Nolis urged us to recognize our biases, but not necessarily to repeal them. And she urged us to bypass categorical thinking, or using Osgood's term, to bypass our psychologic. I'm not sure whether Helen was aware of how far we would come in the course of this conference, but I doubt that many of us had any real foretaste of it. Yet throughout the conference I've sensed an impatience restrained only by practical self-discipline to get on with this $64 question of what should I, as a responsible faculty member or officer of my institution, do about all this? What can I do? The honest question, the honest answer to that question from me is that I don't know. I know that's not satisfactory at this stage of the conference, and so instead of trying to answer it, what I'm going to try to do is to talk around the question and toward the answer. I'll reassure you on one point, I think, and that is that I've been given the opportunity to tell you that I don't know in 30 minutes or 10, and I've chosen the 10. A more important, a more basic, and a more immediate question, which it seems to me must be answered first, is how does your institution perceive its role with respect to the decisions of individual students with regard to drugs? What are the nature, the extent, the limitations of the responsibilities of your college or university, and the responsibilities which they should properly assume in this area? Is it reasonable, for example, to expect that your institution will undertake to distinguish between drug usage which is beneficial, or at least not harmful, and that which is harmful or represents abuse, and by regulation or other means protect students from mistakes which might be harmful to them? Whether or not this is a feasible goal, in that it's possible of attainment, the question I'm raising is it a proper institutional objective for your particular institution? I frankly have been assuming that that responsibility, as stated, would represent, in most colleges and universities, an extension of, or stretching of, the concept of in loco parentis beyond tolerable limits and beyond anything that's educationally justifiable. I have an idea that the program committee was making a similar assumption, but I haven't heard it anywhere stated. And on the other hand, I've wondered, on the basis of some corridor comments I've heard, whether that's the assumption that all of us are making. Because it seemed to me that I've heard suggestions that some of you came to this conference hoping to find the tools to implement a policy which is fundamentally protectionist. Now, possibly I misread these comments, or possibly I was reading into them only what I know about the expectation of certain parents with respect to your institution and mine, the expectation of alumni with respect to your institution and mine, and the expectation of a large segment of the general public. At the other extreme, there's, of course, the alternative that your institution accepts the obligation of trying to provide all available information on which rational decisions might be made by your students, but then is not at all interested in what decisions are made. Frankly, I have a hunch that in the next decade or so, there will be many institutions that, for practical reasons, may be forced into some such position as this. I was very much surprised, however, that it was a representative of a Jesuit institution who was the only one whom I have heard on this program suggest that, Father Perkins, this morning. But since I haven't heard the rest of you make a similar suggestion, and Father Perkins admitted that his president isn't enthusiastic about this concept, I assume that this position is, at least in the future, a bit. The median alternative is that the objection, or the objective of the salvation, not the spiritual salvation, Father Perkins, the physical salvation and protection of students has given way to education in a broader sense, whatever that means. Presumably, it involves the highly optimistic assumption that an enlightened decision based on all available information on the part of an individual student will be a wise decision. At least one which is not demonstrably bad, and a personal decision with which we institutionally can live. Now, I submit that this tests our faith. It tests us greatly, particularly in view of what we've heard, that so many of the really essential and vital facts which are necessary for wise decisions are not really known, but only guessed. So I raise the question as to whether we in our own institutions have the faith to act on the assumption that if a student has made his decision thoughtfully and after careful consideration of all available facts which are relevant, we're prepared to defend his right to make that decision, to defend that decision, his right to make that decision to parents, to alumni, to the public, and even though it involves a violation of the law. But on the other hand, if we're not prepared to go that far, if we set limits short of this, where and how do we set them? These are questions which we can talk about here, but it's clear to me that they must be answered for each individual institution in the light of its special institutional obligations and its special institutional characteristics. Yet against the background of a decision like this, it seems to me that there are some observations which can be made about any ongoing educational program in drug education. And I'd like to throw out just 9 or 10 of them with the very briefest kind of comments for your consideration and later discussion. In the first place, it seems to me that any such program has to be continuous or at least intermittent in order to take into account not only the turnover in students, the turnover in student bodies, but, may I say, the turnover in available factual data. Because certainly there is going to be a turnover, not just additional data, but some of the things that we now know we're going to find out that aren't so, unquestionably, if investigations continue. The point I would make is that I've heard of some campuses in which there's a feeling that somehow or other there's an obligation to have a drug education program, and once that program is done, that discharges the institution's obligation for all time. I suggest it doesn't. Secondly, insofar as we're concerned about authentic information regarding drugs and drug usage, any program should involve the most authoritative people which are available to us. There are probably more resource people in any community than we now realize, and yet they are to be discovered. And these people certainly must be at least as sophisticated as our students are. Third, insofar as we're concerned about the needs of human beings, one of the most significant resources is the students themselves. As Al Rinker pointed out so well, to the extent that turning to drugs is a symptom of a more fundamental sociological and human problem, no attack on the symptoms without regard to the basic problem can be expected to produce any enduring results. Both Al and Richard May emphasized the importance of listening to students, as did Dr. Bruin in his emphasis on understanding the territory. Fifth, it goes without saying, I think, that any kind of educational program which we attempt should involve the broadest possible spectrum of viewpoint. There inevitably, in some areas, will be a temptation to try to nudge students into certain convictions by limiting the views and the range of views to which students are exposed. And I would submit simply that this is a futile undertaking, and any effort to influence student decisions by controlling the ideas to which they're exposed is bound to failure, because in the first place, you have not the control over the sources of ideas, and in the second place, an effort to control it will destroy credibility. Even if it means a full confession regarding the hypocrisy of the don't do as I do about alcohol school, but do as I say about marijuana. And incidentally, I personally am about through apologizing for hypocrisy. I can't get rid of it by apologizing for it. I'm now looking for the values of it. And one of these days I may be able to come up with the essay that I've been working on in defense of hypocrisy. I honestly think if it didn't have more values, more positive values than we have ascribed to it, it wouldn't have been around so long. Sixth, if we should recognize but not conceal our biases. And from my own standpoint, I think I can't emphasize this too much. We should certainly distinguish it between those views which we hold, which are based on experimental evidence, and those which are based on faith, but we shouldn't apologize for those that are based on faith. Neither should we strive for a position of neutrality. I have never forgotten a deeply troubled student who came to talk to me a few years ago about her instructor in the history of Western civilization. She said, "He's driving me crazy. I can't find out where he stands. He must have biases. He's human. I know I could cope with him if I could find out what they are, but he's driving me crazy. I can't find out what these biases are." And I submit your biases will be respected a lot more if they are known, and they'll be coped with and discounted. But in order to function, you ought to admit them at least to yourself. Point 7, I think we should not apologize because all the facts are not known, or because, as a matter of fact, so few of the facts are known. I believe most of our young people today have learned better than we that we're living in a world of uncertainty, and they're more prepared to come to grips with a world of uncertainty. And the most important observation about this is to learn to distinguish between what is known and what is only suspected. Just as we see that there's no substitute for listening to students themselves if we want to understand them, I think also there's no substitute for listening to them and taking advantage of their wisdom on how to communicate with them and their fellow students once we've identified the framework of an educational program which we wish to promote. I know of a number of, or I've understood, there have been a number of very fine drug education programs on college campuses, not so far from here. That is, they, on paper, were very fine programs, but they apparently did not click because they did not make contact with the students to whom they were directed. They probably could have if students had been involved in how to communicate them to the population for which they were intended. Ninth, I think we must accept the fact, as I think Arlie Williams was telling us this morning on the panel, that on the basis of careful consideration of all available evidence, there are going to be lots of students who are going to make decisions about the use of drugs that are different from ours. And there isn't anything we can do about that beyond making sure that the students have all the information which they need. In fact, the use of drugs is certainly a fact of life, and we must recognize it. But finally, just as a specific educational program devoted to accurate information about drug usage is important, so it is not enough. We must re-examine our entire educational program in the realm of human values, as Al Weisbod brought out so forcibly in his call for an examination of our entire approach to the educational program. Admittedly, it is far beyond the scope of this conference to deal adequately with the whole broad question of the role of higher education. But by the same token, I frankly find it impossible to deal definitively with the question of our obligations in drug education without examining the institutional role and what your school has undertaken as its objectives in education. In summary, we're now going into discussion sessions, and as I understand, these discussion sessions are possibly to cover last night's program as well as all the programs which have occurred today. But my suggestion is that if you don't have anything more important to talk about, we, as we return to our home institutions, are faced with two major challenges. And these summarize, I think, all the observations that I've made up to this point. The first one is fairly specific. That's to decide how best to marshal the institutional community, that is the resources in our institutional communities, to provide the most viable continuing program to extend understanding about the facts of the use of drugs and abuse of drugs, hopefully as a basis for intelligent, rational decisions on the part of students, but not necessarily so, and on the assumption that this body of facts is going to be an expanding body of information. But this leads us inevitably to the second, more comprehensive challenge, because one of the very significant sets of relevant facts is to be found in the human needs which have given rise to this phenomenon that we refer to as the drug culture, not just the LSD hippie culture, but the broader drug culture of which this and we are an integral part. For those of us in student personnel, this calls for a re-examination of our counseling services, our entire student regulations, student discipline, and our relationships with law enforcement agents. But it calls for an even more for a reexamination of the broader area of the role of our individual institutions in higher education in facilitating the mutually constructive interaction between individual students and contemporary society. As I say, if you don't have anything more important to talk about in the next hour, those items should be a beginning.
Thank you very much, Don. I would ask that the discussion leaders make sure that their groups adjourn very promptly. We would like to begin here at 2:45, and I believe that Dr. Nala's summary will see that we are dismissed at 3:15, certainly no later than 3:30. The meeting will be officially adjourned at 3:30, and if Dr. Nala talks beyond that point, she's on her own. But now we will adjourn to our discussion groups and be back in this room then at 2:45. Thanks, Don. That set the stage. Well, we don't get the point now, we might as well quit. We'd like to begin this session now is that it is an important session, and secondly, I'm told that by 3:30 or 3:25, the USC UCLA basketball crowd will be leaving the pavilion, so it's a matter of self-preservation here that we look after our own. For the arbitrary manner in which it has sometimes seemed necessary to operate as moderator, I apologize. I know there were people who still wanted to ask questions when I felt we needed to move on to the next session, and for any arbitrary decisions which may have caused some personality difficulties here and so on, I sincerely apologize for this. I do want to just take this opportunity to express appreciation to all who had a part in this program. This is a broad statement, of course, but I'm thinking of the Dean's Association, the Federal Drug Administration, the committee members, the program participants, and of course all of the folks who were here participating in this conference. And especially to Dr. Nahles for giving us counsel and guidance in preparing for the conference and in her participation here with us at UCLA. And now I'd like to call on Dr. Nahles for a resume and evaluation.
Thank you, Stan. I'm not going to try to give you a resume of what you've been through. It's happened too fast. My mind is whirling. This is the 6th conference that I have had in 3 weeks, 2 a week, and most of them have been pretty swinging conferences, and it's going to take me a little while to pull things together. But I thought I would like to share with you some of the things which it has seemed to me have come out of all of these conferences. And it's simply amazing that committees of 10 people in 7 different regions of the country could plan and execute conferences which had so much in common. The pattern in each one of the conferences, even though they've come pretty much to the same conclusions, has been quite different. For instance, at Portland earlier this week, we reached the stage by the end of the first morning, because of the particular participants that were involved, that we didn't arrive at here until late this morning. I'm not sure that they gained anything by having much longer time to discuss all these things. I think maybe this afternoon session and your discussion groups, and particularly Don Winbigler's excellent challenge to you, has really served a purpose. I think, though, as I think back over the conferences, the things that have stood out to me, and I throw them out to you to take back with you and think about, is, first of all, a feeling that we should put this whole problem of drug use and abuse on campus in perspective. And that perhaps one of the main values that it serves, since, and as I have monitored the evaluations and we asked you where does it stand, it looks to me as though most of you feel that the search for values and alcohol are the real problems on campus, and the drug abuse problem looked at in the total perspective is fairly low on the totem pole. But I think that we've, in all of the conferences, have sort of come out with the feeling that we weren't just talking about drug abuse, as has been mentioned several times, that this is a symptom of something far more deep, and if we could use this as an avenue to approach some of the more basic problems, that perhaps we would not only have served to equip you to deal with a relatively minor problem on campus, but pointed to some of the ways in which you could look at some of the other problems. In this connection, I can't help but resume my sociological social psychology role, and with Howard Becker, remind you that behind every rule, behind every policy is a value. And I would like to suggest to you that it will be far more fruitful not only in dealing with this problem, but in contributing to the solutions of some of the other problems, if you go back to your campus and don't worry about the wording of this, the wording of that, this regulation, that regulation, but carry on a dialogue at the level of values. You know, values are a very interesting thing. We have personal values, we have societal values. Sometimes the two coincide, sometimes they differ. But even within the personal realm or within the societal realm, values have a way of conflicting. And I'm sure that I could ask all of you to list 10 values in which you believe. And I could set up for you hypothetical and not so hypothetical situation in which you had to make a basic choice. So I think one of the things that I would like to suggest to you, and this is sort of a feeling that's been rolling up through these 6 conferences, is to go back and think and talk about values and sort out your values. This has implications for you as student personnel administrators or whatever your role is. It also, I think, has value for you as a part of the administration of a college. In this connection, I would suggest that the dialogue needs to be very extensive. It needs to include all parts of the university, and I even dare to suggest up to the level of the president or the chancellor or whoever he may be. And I think if we can sort out some of these relative values and attack it at the value level and can come to some agreement, faculty, students, middle administration, top administration, trustees, even community, that we may make some progress on some of these problems. I think it's a great mistake to think that any one segment of the university can deal with this problem or with any other problem. It needs a team approach, and it needs to push us back to some pretty basic values. In these conferences, there have been a great variety of institutions represented. And I'm continually reminded of a panel that we had at the Atlanta conference, which was our first one, where a man from a large state university in a southern state said, now look, all of this talk is fine, but in my state, the legislature has spelled out our charter, and our two purposes are to educate and to protect morals. And in our state, the legislature even goes one step farther and defines the morals. Now, what am I going to do? I sit and I nod my head, and then I think, back home? I do think that everybody has to get into this act at the value level. In this connection, I think we want to recognize that there are a great variety of institutions, and what may be perfectly appropriate for one institution may not, for a great variety of reasons, be appropriate for another institution. At our institution, which is a small private university, we've recognized this to the extent that each division of the university has sort of a trustee committee. They're not advisory, they're sort of liaison. And when I go back to Rochester, finally, one of my tasks will be to sit down with this committee and talk about this project and what seems to have come out of it. And I'm sure that when we get to the point where we have something to say, we will have people that understand how we arrived at whatever position we take. I was on a panel in Chicago, the American Higher Education Association, with Fred Heckinger. The name's just blurred. And after sitting and listening to us struggle with the problem of in loco parentis and this, that, and the rules and regulations, a variety of things, he, from his sort of detached point of view, said, I think you've made yourselves an awful lot of problems because you're trying to be all things to all people. And he was talking about institutions in general. His suggestion, just sort of thrown out for consideration, was that there should be a variety of institutions, not on the basis of the programs that they offer, but on the basis of their style of education. And for what still, from everything I've been able to hear, is the large majority of students who are what Kenneth Kennison calls the professionalists, reasonably mature, reasonably adult, very clear about what they want to do and how they're going to get there, that we should have institutions which don't have residence halls, don't have anything but an academic program. And we say to these students and to their family and to the community in which the institution is, we consider these young people pretty close to being adults. We're concerned with their cognitive development. They are going to live with you in the community, learn to take part in the community, and accept responsibility for their behavior in the community. And then he said at the other end, with all gradations between, I think there should be institutions where you really mean what you say or don't say or imply in loco parentis, so that the students and the parents and the community and everybody knows what you are prepared to do. And that when we get into this middle ground where we try to be all things to all people, we just can't win. I throw that out just for discussion. All right, attack this at the level of values. Involve the total community. Now, this isn't going to be easy, but I think that if you're going to have any viable programs or any viable policies, you must involve the total community. And not be in the position of one place that I know where the student personnel staff had worked out a very nice policy. It had been communicated up and down the line, and people had nodded their heads and thought everybody was all set. A problem arose. The dean of students was out of town. His second in command was out of town. It immediately got kicked up to the provost level, and the provost, not having been in on all this discussion, had to act. and acted in a way so that the students said, but you said this was the policy. In other words, we'd been talking to the students. We hadn't been talking to him, and we had some problems. Involve the whole community. Once you set up lines of communication, even on one problem, like the problem of the use and abuse of drugs, those lines of communication should serve you well in other areas. Behind every rule of value, attack these values at the team approach. Now, in some of the conferences, we've gotten right down to what do you do when you're in a position, given position. Do you cooperate with local enforcement authorities? Do you permit search? What about double jeopardy and all of these problems? I would suggest in this connection that the time to make a policy or to think things through or to marshal one's forces is not at the time of a crisis. A number of people, as we've been around the country, say, well, I'm not sure that we have a drug problem. I don't think we do. You know, I really didn't know whether I should come to this conference. I think if there's one thing that all of them have shown pretty clearly is the time to grapple with the problem is before the crisis arises. Because I don't think that we make our best judgments or make use of our best resources when forced in a 24-hour period to come out with some action or some statement which will make all of our constituents happy. The whole problem of confidentiality has come up over and over again. We could spend a lot of time discussing it. I would like to suggest that one of the problems in this area, and I think it was hinted at by our student health director who spoke and some of our other people, that we as administrators, and I'm speaking now for deans, have to be pretty clear in our own mind what our role is. As a chief administrator, I think that whether we intended it or not, we have taken on certain responsibilities which may interfere with responsibilities that we have had when we were in other roles. And I think every dean of students would really like to be right in there with the students. Some of them, because of previous roles, have established relationships which they would like to maintain. However, I think it's very, very difficult to mix the administrative role, the advocate role, and the counselor role. And I would suggest for your consideration that you might look at this role, its function, and the question of who can do what best, and suggest that you might find that despite the fact that you like to have the student coming in, you like to feel you have your finger on the pulse, there are other ways to do it. But make it very, very clear when a student comes to you that he must perforce come to you as an administrator. And if you don't want this, then just don't be an administrator. Because once you get involved in this administration counseling role conflict, I think the student is misled and sometimes we ourselves are misled. And I can tell you for myself that, you know, I'm beginning to wonder whether I really want to be a dean of students, whether I really wouldn't be back there working with the students either at a research level or some other level. But I think we have to decide what our main role is and not let one role interfere with the other role. So that many times students whom I've known all through their college years come to me and I have to say, look, on this problem, I'm not the person to talk to, because I must accept my administrative responsibilities. But go talk to Dr. Vest, go talk to him, even go talk to my husband. I have sort of a nice way out on that, and a lot of them do. But I think we do have to be very careful that we don't communicate to the students that we can guarantee something which, because of role responsibilities which we've accepted, we can't really deliver, or else we go through all kinds of conscience and struggles with our own conscience in trying to deal with them. At the Portland conference, Arthur Pearl got us off to a real swinging start when he simply ripped apart the whole role of the dean of students and then proceeded to rip apart sort of the whole academic status quo. One thing which he mentioned, which I think is quite interesting, he suggested that we as student personnel administrators might want to rethink our role. And he felt that one thing that we should consider was that we should be the advocate of the student. That, you see, we're right in the middle. We can face to the right or face to the left. And rather than being the arm of the central administration, that we take advantage of our middle position and frankly and openly reconstruct our roles as the advocate of the student. And he seemed to feel that right now in higher education, what the student needed more than anything else was an advocate. I think I'll leave this part of it here and just tell you a little bit about what we'd like to do and what we may be able to do in the few remaining months of our short-lived drug education project. This thing is sort of mushroomed. We feel that we've opened up a number of areas that we sort of hadn't planned to open up, that we've created some needs that when we originally thought about this, we did not envisage fulfilling. There have been a number of requests that we set up a national speakers panel with people scattered in regions all over the country, and that colleges could write to us for suggestions for people who had agreed, had said they were willing to do at least a certain amount of this. And the college then, at their own expense, could get some of the resources which we have begun to bring together as we have operated in all areas of the country. There will be this summer distributed to all institutions of higher education in the country a handbook for college administrators, and this frightens me more than anything else in the whole project. It didn't seem like such a terrifying task when I started out, but the more I've learned, the less I know, and the less I want to set myself up as an expert to tell college administrators what to do. I shall depend very heavily on the reports from the small group discussions as they have come in from all over the country. In designing this book, I have some ideas about what it should include. There's also been the request that we serve sort of as an information exchange, where if a college is going to, feels that they want to write a policy, that they can share the experience of other schools. Whether or not we can manage this, I don't know. All I can say at this point is that if you are on the roster of one of these conferences, you will be informed of whatever we manage to do. I think in closing, I would like to express my deep appreciation and my deep indebtedness to the National Institutes of Mental Health and to the Food and Drug Administration, without whom the program would not have been possible at all, and without whom I would not have been put in such immediate touch with things that were going on in this across the country that hadn't reached the publication stage. In other words, they let me in on an awful lot and were a tremendous help to me, particularly Dr. Jerome Levine at the National Institutes of Mental Health, Dr. Fox and Dr. Smith at the Food and Drug Administration. So this really has been a joint project. they're not just, Food and Drug is not just footing a large part of the bill, but it's been in there pitching with us. And in this connection, I would like to suggest, apropos the point I made of marshaling your forces before a crisis, to point out that there are many advantages in making contacts with and getting to know your law enforcement officers, both in the Bureau of Narcotics, in the Food and Bureau of Drug Abuse Control, and your local enforcement officers. And one of the questions that Betty did pull out was, what about the laws? One of my fondest hopes when I started out was that I could get from Washington a compendium of the state laws, and we could put them all in your kits and you'd have all the answers. But it turns out this is not nearly as easy as it might sound. And then I thought we might write to each of the attorney generals, but that didn't prove feasible. But I would strongly urge that you get in touch with these men on let's share our concern, let's share information, get accurate information about your local, state, and federal laws through these agents. Get to know them, not in a crisis, not when they come with a warrant and say, we want to search this room, not when they come with a student that they've arrested. Because I think basically, despite our different screens, our different sets of attitudes and beliefs, our different backgrounds, the different way in which we look at all these problems, that there are some basic concerns which we can share. And I think if we share at this level, we'll find that we can work better in the crises that in many instances do arise. Thank you for being such good participants, and have fun when you get back to your campus.